Welcome again to the Miracle of America. We're now on lesson number 11, part 2. And this brings us to Article 4 of the Constitution, which has to do with relationships between the states. Now today that isn't considered to be such a big deal, but I'll tell you it was in the days of the Founding Fathers. When they met at Independence Hall and tried to figure out how they could get those 13 states to be friends with each other, that wasn't an easy task to even contemplate, because as of that time, New England was threatening to leave the Union, and each of the states was treating the others like foreign countries. And so they wanted to take the things that had really caused most of the problems and the troubles, see if they couldn't iron those out in Article 4 of the Constitution. So let's go to Section 1. What could they do so that the actions of one state could be binding on all the other states? Could they work that out so that all the states would accept what each of the other states was doing? See, that was the task. How do you accomplish that? And so all is your first blank there under Roman numeral 1. Well, they said, first of all, we're going to require each of the states to give full faith and credit to whatever happens in any of the other states. Whatever they do, the other states have to give full faith and credit. Otherwise, we are not a United States. We're a disunited States. So that's your first blanks. Full faith and credit. Now, they gave Congress the authority to decide what the proof should be. In other words, I come in and say, well, this is what happened to me over in this state, and you've got to give full faith and credit to it. The Congress decides what documentary proof is necessary for me to be able to say that. Proof is your next blank there. All right, Roman numeral 2. Listen to this, because you go on a vacation sometime, you're going to need to know this. It says that the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens, and that's your blank, in the several states. All right? What does privileges and immunities refer to? Well, it refers to all the national rights. That's your blank. All the national rights that we have as American citizens. And that means you're entitled to travel freely throughout any of the states. You can set up a business in any of the states. You can sue in any of the states. Those are your national rights. Now, I want to tell you about some other kind that may be confusing to you. Capital B. It does not include acquired rights, which the citizens of a particular state have developed through their expenses, their taxes, and their ingenuity. These are acquired rights. That's your blank. For example, this will include hunting the deer, for example, in a state where they've spent a lot of money developing their herd, or putting fish in the stream, or otherwise developing special resources. It will also include the schools and the colleges they've developed, particularly the higher education areas. You would have to pay special fees, additional fees, because you are not a taxpayer. You didn't help build those things up. Those are acquired rights that those people of that state have developed. And that's, I think you'll all agree, that's reasonable. So number 2 is fees. Fees. Number 1 was hunting, fishing, attending state-supported colleges, etc. Number 2, fees. All right, now, what about a person who commits a crime in one state and he flees across the line so nobody can catch him? What about that? Well, it's true that if a crime is committed in Missouri and a fellow runs across over into Kansas, the officers of Missouri are not authorized to go over there and fetch him back. They have no authority, no jurisdiction over in that state whatsoever. So if he flees, and that's your blank, we've got to have some federal machinery to bring him back. And so we do. We call it extradition. So that a governor of Missouri can ask that the governor of Kansas to send that man back and send proof of the fact that there's reasonable cause to believe he committed a certain crime. So capital A is return. Now, does the governor have to do it? What if the governor finds out that there's a plan to lynch this fellow when they get him back? He's not really going to get a fair trial. What about that? And so the Supreme Court has held that it's up to the governor, who has a man in his custody whom he's supposed to be protecting as he does all the citizens of his state, not to allow him to be extradited unless he's convinced in his own mind that the man will receive safe and just treatment. And so that's your blank, safe and just treatment. And now Roman numeral 4 is of historical significance only. It's now obsolete. And it has to do with the problem they once had of bond servants and slaves running away and going into a free state. And then the free state not cooperating in the return of that individual to fulfill his term of service or whatever it was. It was a kind of a miserable, difficult problem, really. But it all became obsolete with the 13th Amendment, because all of the states are free states now, and everybody that's in this country is free. All right, so that's obsolete. Roman numeral 4 is obsolete. And I will remind you that at the Constitutional Convention, it was some of the founding fathers from the South that that took the initiative in solving this whole problem of slavery. And then it was talked over and decided to give it a little time to phase out, which it didn't do as rapidly as it should have. Anyway, in some of these serious problems of the past, I have found that no section of the country can point the finger at some other section, because everybody had forward-thinking, fine people trying to solve the problem, and every state had some selfish interests and sometimes some cruel interests that had other points of view. Now, Roman numeral 5 there, Section 3 of Article 4 provides for the creation of new states. There are going to be some new states. You know, the founding fathers were just on the Atlantic seaboard, and they talked about their commonwealth covering the whole North American continent. In fact, they put right in the Articles of Confederation that Canada could be the 14th state, but she didn't elect at that time to come in. Now, we need a provision for the dividing of existing states if they think they're too big. Dividing is your blank. And the combining of states that already exist. Maybe Rhode Island wants to join with Connecticut. She's such a little state. No, indeed, Rhode Island didn't want to do that, but supposing she did sometime. All right, we've got to have provision for it. And then how about creating new states out of federal territory, like the Northwest Territory, and later all of the West? Got to have some provision for that, for sure. Well, creating is your third blank. Now, the founders said, whenever this is done, there has to be the consent of the Congress and the legislatures of the states involved. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I guess there's only one special situation, as I recall, and that's Texas. Texas has it provided that she can divide into 5 states anytime she wants to. And sometimes I'm down there, there are a fine group of constitutionalists down there, and I say, it'd be great if you divided into 5 states. That would give you 10 senators instead of 2. What a power for good you could be in the Senate. And then you know what the Texans say? No, we just want to be the biggest. And I guess Alaska is just about the biggest in territory now, but Texas is the biggest in inhabited, settled land. Anyway, the Northwest Ordinance, adopted by Congress July 13, 1787, see, that's the same year the Constitution was written, said any new states coming in must come in equal to the original states. Equal with the original states. That's your blank, equal. All right, now, the states that first came in after the first 13, as they began to come in from the Northwest Territory and east of the Mississippi, they all came in equal, and that's your blank under number 1. They came in equal. However, the Louisiana Purchase, I should say, also came in equal. However, when they started settling the western states, now you had a different picture entirely. The western states were all strong-armed and intimidated, so that when they came in, the federal government, and that's your blank, the federal government insisted on them giving up a great deal of their valuable land before they would give them statehood. And that was all unconstitutional. And so just recently, those states have asked for their land back. They've called it the Sagebrush Rebellion, but it isn't a rebellion at all. They're going through the regular constitutional, legally set up channels in order to get their land back. Now you just imagine for a minute, if you don't happen to live in the western states, what it would be in your state. You see, in let's say Nevada, the federal government occupies there a total of 87%. See, that's nearly 90% of all the land in Nevada the federal government kept. 45% of all of California, 66% of all of Utah. And then when it came to Alaska, they said, this is Alaska. And then they kept all of Alaska except 4%. 96% of all of Alaska was retained by the federal government. And I just got back from Alaska, and I want to tell you those people are mighty unhappy with the way they've been treated. Anyway, that blank for number 3 is sagebrush, right? All right, now we come to another delicate one that rose to prominence just recently, and that's the fact that Congress, only Congress, can give away territory of the United States or any possessions of the United States or any property of the United States. Only Congress. All right, capital A. This provision was completely violated when we gave away a most valuable property of the United States, the Panama Canal. Instead of going to Congress as required by the Constitution, the executive branch decided to do it through a treaty. That's number 1, through a treaty. All right, they signed a treaty with what many Americans considered a communist dictator, closely allied with Fidel Castro, and promised in addition to pay millions and millions of dollars every year to run the canal until the year 2000 when they'd get full title to it. 80% of the American people, according to the polls, didn't want it to happen. The president insisted that he felt it was right and it was going to go through. And so it was sort of strong-armed through. And the treaty was signed, and that meant that it had to be ratified. The Senate had to ratify it, and that's your next blank. And the Senate was strong-armed until you got 2/3 of the Senate ratifying it. But the Congress as such, the House of Representatives and the Senate, never, what shall we say, achieved that transaction. It was done by the executive branch of government using its power that it does have over many congressmen and senators to sort of strong-arm its way through in violation of the Constitution. We're going to regret that one of these days. I'm quite confident. All right, Roman numeral 7. Section 3 provides that the United States federal government will guarantee that every state enjoys a representative or republican form of government. That's what the word republican means. It means a government of the people, with decisions being made through its representatives elected by the people themselves. All right, Republican is A. Now, in many of our states, we have, in our generation, it's quite recent, what we call the initiative referendum. The initiative referendum. I-N-I-T-I-A-T-I-V-E, initiative referendum. That means that the people initiate a bill, a law. Now, this is not republicanism. This is not the Founding Fathers' idea, and they would have considered it dangerous, even though sometimes it accomplishes good. The idea is that the people can go ahead and get a law going which the legislature either has passed and they want to reverse it, or the legislature wouldn't do anything about it and they wanted it done. And so on this grassroots level they do it. But notice what happens. Many times the issue, when it's presented to the people, is so technical that if you're against it, you vote yes. And if you're for it, you vote no. Have you noticed that? I tell you, that's clever strategy. The founder said, beware of this. This is not a good direction to go. I could give you some interesting examples of that, by the way, if there were time. Well, under this provision, the federal government has the responsibility to protect every state from having a dictator set up or having an invasion by another state or a foreign power, and that's your blank, invasion. And it also authorizes the federal government to come in, if necessary, when the governor, the legislature invites it, or other circumstances warrant it, to put down insurrection and violence. And that's your blank, capital C, violence. Violence. All right, now that's all of that article. Now we move over to Article 5, which is the amending process. Now, the founders said, pay attention to this, because the amending of the Constitution may be necessary. We don't think so, but it might, and we've set it up so that you can do it. But never do it for light or capricious reasons. Always think through your amendments very carefully, because you're changing the whole structure of government. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, you couldn't amend unless all of the states agreed. And during the Revolutionary War, they had several good ideas they tried to add to the Articles, and one little stinker would hold out every time. One little state would say, no, they'd get stubborn. And so that's why we really had to rewrite the Constitution, or write the Constitution we now have. Now, it's important to realize that the shaking down of an issue that's going to change structure of government by amendment needs to really go through that kind of process. Let me give you an example. Take the ERA amendment. Because so many of us are for equal rights for women, it went right through Congress with very little resistance. And then it went out to the states, and they're all for equal rights for women, and so it went through 30 states in 1 year. They all ratified. Looked like it was going to go right through. And then, do you know what happened? The women got to reading that amendment. It didn't even mention women. And they began to notice that if that went through, women would start losing many of their rights they now have. For example, their husbands no longer are legally bound to support them and their family. If a woman is a housewife, she gets no Social Security unless her husband will pay double. And if she's just a housewife with no other income, she wouldn't be able to go down and get credit without her husband signing for her. There's no longer a law to protect her and require him to support her. And some of the states have already adopted this ERA, and I'll tell you, there's weeping and wailing in those states by many of the women. So they started fighting it. That's just a very interesting example of why it's important to let the thing go through the shakedown process of an amendment. Let everybody take a good hard look at it, because we want equal rights for women. The ERA turned out to be a booby trap, the women said, and so millions of them turned against it. And in the next 6 years, after 30 had adopted, only 5 more adopted it and 3 rescinded. And then the time finally ran out, and Congress unconstitutionally tried to extend it. But 28 of the states said our ratification only lasts until 7 years, and so it probably is dead now. But the main thing was, it wasn't a good amendment. It didn't do what they said it was going to do, and that's the advantage of the shakedown process. All right, how do you amend the Constitution? Here's the easy way, and the only one we've ever used. You get 2/3 of the House and the Senate to adopt it. 2/3 is your first blank. Then you send it out to the state legislatures, and 3/4 of the state legislatures have to adopt it. Then it becomes part of our Constitution. And if 3/4 don't adopt it, it's null and void. All right? The second method we've never used, and that's to have 2/3 of the states say to the Congress, we want a constitutional convention where we can amend the Constitution. And if that had ever happened, the Congress would have told the states to send delegates to a convention. Then that convention would have worked out the amendments that they wanted and sent it to the state legislatures, and 3/4 of the legislatures could then ratify. Notice that eliminates Congress completely. So it's just never been used, So let's see if you've got all of the blanks there for B. B is 2/3, and down under number 2 is 2/3 again, and then 3 is 3/4. Did you get all of that? All right, Roman numeral 2. Now there are 2 restrictions on the amending process. One of them doesn't apply anymore, but it was put there originally because they said no amendment can be passed giving the federal government authority to regulate or eliminate slavery before 1808. We're going to give the area that has bond servants or slaves time to kind of work this thing out. Now, some of the northern states had some problems there, by the way. But we're going to give them 20 years to work it out before the federal government gets jurisdiction. And then John Adams said, we will eliminate this cancer from our society. So 1808 is your blank. Now, it is also provided that no state without its consent could have its equality reduced in the Senate. See, every state, little tiny states, brand new states, big states, they all have just 2 senators in the Senate. It's equal there. Now, that provides that cannot be reduced. No state without its consent can have its equality reduced. And you wouldn't think any state would want to. Now, recently something happened which was a very serious violation of this provision, and that's your blank, violation. Let's see, first consent and then violation. 2 blanks in B. Consent and violation. What was this? It was giving the District of Columbia 2 senators and a congressman without it ever becoming a state. In other words, it has all the representation of a state, and it's only a city of 800,000 people. Well, I don't know what was in the mind of the majority of Congress, but they swept that amendment right through the House and the Senate. 2/3 of them put that through, then sent it out to the states. And the states would be losing, really, their equality in the Senate when it's just a city of 800,000 has 2 senators to represent them. So only 8 states as of today, as far as I recall, about 8 states have ratified it. The rest are just sitting on it. I doubt if it'll ever go through. It shouldn't go through. It's a bad amendment. Then there would be another city wants 2 senators, and another city, and another city. It would fragment our whole society and our culture. All right? Article 6. Federal supremacy. Now, when the federal government was set up, you know, it's supposed to be a great thing to have a federal government that's new powers and everything. That sounds pretty good, but the federal government also took on some obligations and responsibilities when it was set up. And maybe that's not so pleasant, but anyway, here it is. They have to assume, or they decided to assume, they didn't have to, but they decided to assume all the debts contracted by the old government. Now, that was a great surprise to Europe, because in Europe, every time they turn over a government, they cancel out all the past debts, and each new government starts from scratch. And they expected the United States government to just absolutely abrogate and abandon all of its previous debts. The Founding Fathers said that's not right. Even though many of those debts are owed to people outside the United States, it isn't right to abrogate them. We are the same people, and we're a people of honor. And those debts were not small by their evaluation in those days. The states alone had spent over $25 million in debt, gotten into indebtedness of $25 million during the Revolutionary War, and that's your blank, during the Revolutionary War. Now, if you add what the federal government had spent and gotten into debt over, you have a total of $79 million, and that's capital B, 79. That's a lot of money, totaled all together. But instead of their just wiping it out and saying, no, we're not going to be responsible for that, they went right ahead and announced that they would eventually tax themselves sufficiently to pay it off. They would honor their legitimate obligations of the past. And that's your blank, honor. And that's the way Europe interpreted it. These are a people of honor and responsibility if they'll do that. And so we'll loan them more money. That's what put us back on our feet. The fact that they had confidence that we would pay our debts. All right, Roman numeral 2. It was provided that in this great national structure that we were setting up, there were certain laws and provisions that would be supreme over all the states. Number 1, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Constitution. Number 2, the laws that are passed by Congress become the supreme law of the land. The laws. Number 3, the treaties that are entered into by the president with foreign countries and ratified by our Senate. That becomes the supreme law of the land. I want you to notice, however, that it makes no reference to executive agreements by the president with foreign powers, and no reference to executive orders that are being used so much, no reference to edicts by regulatory agencies, and no reference to edicts by the Supreme Court which constitute judicial legislation. We have wandered a long ways away from the original success formula, and we're paying for it daily with problems that just never should have arisen. And it says that the judges shall recognize that in their states they must enforce and respect these supreme laws of the country, their own laws or constitution of the state to the contrary notwithstanding. And so capital C is Constitution with a small c. It applies to the Constitution of the state. Roman numeral 3, so that everybody appreciates the fact that the United States is now the supreme government of all of the people of this great country. every officer, both on the state and federal level, has to take an oath, as the President is doing here, as you see on the screen, that he will uphold the Constitution of the United States and defend it against all enemies, foreign or domestic. So you have oath and Constitution are the two blanks there. And now we come last of all to Article 7, which is ratifying the Constitution. You see, when the Founding Fathers got through, after 4 months of sweat and labor and digesting and sent that out to the Congress and the people, they knew it was going to be tough before they got it ratified, and they knew that some states might never ratify it. And so they provided that only 9 states would have to ratify it and accept it to make it operational. So that's number 1, Roman numeral 1, is 9. 9. And the new Constitution was only to be binding on those that did ratify it. There was no provision to compel, and that's your blank, no provision to compel the other states to come in unless they wished to. And at that time, there were at least 3 that they didn't think would come in at that time. It was Maryland, New York, and Rhode Island. They didn't think those 3 would adopt it or ratify it. And so actually, this is the form in which the Constitution was finally submitted to the Congress. Now, the Congress didn't take very long to work it over. They didn't make any changes. It looked pretty good to them. In fact, many members of the Constitutional Convention were in Congress there to defend it. And then they sent it out to the states. Oh, what a furor. We discussed this a little earlier, remember. I'll tell you, there was an uproar when it went out to the states. They saw all kinds of problems, and the Federalist Papers were written to explain to the people every important point of the entire Constitution, for which I'm grateful, because now you have no doubt in your mind what the Founding Fathers really meant. And so the founders said to the states, look, submit to us any suggested amendments. And in the first session of Congress, we'll get those going and send them out to the states. So the states all sent in a total of 189 suggested amendments, and Madison largely was responsible for boiling them all down into 12 proposed amendments that were approved by Congress, but when they went out to the states, only 10 of them were actually ratified. One of them that was turned down, we later put in the 14th Amendment, and Madison said it was a good one, we need it. Well, that brings us to our Bill of Rights, and that's what we're going to start with now on lesson number 12 at our next lesson. And I want to tell you that is an exciting thing, because many things in the Bill of Rights are now being violated, and our people need to know their history and their intent and how we can get them back into focus like the founders intended them. Thank you very much.